Girl says you're my father. To unknown millionaire. What happens next leaves everyone in shock. Welcome to the channel. Enjoy the video. Give it a like, subscribe, turn on notifications, comment and share. The scorching Arizona. Sun beat down on the bustling streets of Phoenix as Sophie Anderson, a petite 10-year-old with fiery red hair and freckles, stood nervously outside Rosie's diner. Her small hands clutched a worn photograph, her green eyes fixed on the sleek, black Mercedes pulling up to the curb. As the car door opened, Sophie's heart raced. This was her moment. A tall, well-dressed man stepped out, his salt-and-pepper hair neatly combed back. He adjusted his designer sunglasses, seemingly oblivious to the little girl watching his every move. Sophie took a deep breath, summoning all her courage. "Excuse me, sir," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you Nathan Reynolds?" The man turned, surprise evident on his face. "Yes, I am. Do I know you, young lady?" Sophie's eyes widened. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for her entire life. With shaking hands, she held up the photograph. I think you're my father." Nathan's jaw dropped. He stared at Sophie, then at the photograph, his face a mix of confusion and disbelief. "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake. I don't have any children." Sophie's heart sank, but she pressed on. "But look at the picture. That's you, isn't it? With my mom, Grace Anderson?" Nathan took the photograph, studying it closely. His brow furrowed as he examined the image of a younger version of himself, with his arm around a beautiful blonde woman. This does look like me, but I don't remember." "Sophie!" a woman's voice called out. Grace Anderson rushed over, her waitress uniform indicating she'd just finished her shift at the diner. "Sophie, what are you doing?" "I'm so sorry, sir. My daughter has an overactive imagination." Nathan looked up from the photo, his eyes meeting. "Grace's?" Recognition flickered across his face. Grace Anderson, is that really you?" Grace froze, her blue eyes widening in shock. Nathan Reynolds, oh my God, I can't believe it's you." Sophie looked between the two adults, confusion and hope battling in her young mind. "Mom, do you know him? Is he really my dad?" Grace knelt beside her daughter, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, it's complicated. Mr. Reynolds." "Nathan, he's not your father, but he does look exactly like him." Nathan's mind was reeling. "Grace, what's going on? This little girl thinks I'm her father in that picture. It looks just like me, but I swear I've never met you before today." Grace stood up, her face a mix of emotions. "Nathan, there's something you need to know. Do you have a few minutes? We should talk privately." Nathan nodded, still visibly shaken. "Of course. My office is just around the corner. We can talk there." As they walked, Sophie's mind raced with questions. If this man wasn't her father, why did he look exactly like the man in the photo? And why did her mum seem to know him? Inside Nathan's plush office, Grace sat Sophie down with a tablet to keep her occupied while the adults talked. Nathan closed the door to his private study, turning to face Grace with a questioning look. "All right, Grace, please explain what's going on. Why does your daughter think I'm her father?" Grace took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting nervously. "Nathan, what I'm about to tell you might come as a shock. 11 years ago, I met a man named Thomas Reynolds in Sedona. We had a whirlwind romance and, well, Sophie was the result. But Thomas disappeared before I could tell him I was pregnant." Nathan's face paled. "Thomas Reynolds? That's impossible. I don't have a brother named Thomas." Grace's eyes widened. "You don't know? Nathan, Thomas is your twin brother." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Nathan stumbled back, gripping the edge of his desk for support. My twin brother? That's not possible. I'm an only child." Grace reached into her purse, pulling out another photograph. This one showed two identical boys, about 8 years old, grinning at the camera. "Thomas showed me this picture. He said you were separated as children when your parents divorced. He thought you knew about him." Nathan stared at the photograph, his mind reeling. Memories he'd long suppressed began to surface, fragmented images of a boy who looked just like him, laughter echoing in a sunny backyard, tearful goodbyes at... An airport. I remember, he whispered, his voice barely audible. We were 8 when our parents split up. Dad took me to New York and Mom must have taken Thomas. I thought it was just a dream or my imagination. They never talked about it, and eventually I forgot. Sophie, who had been pretending not to listen, couldn't contain herself any longer. So if you're not my dad, does that mean this Thomas is? Grace and Nathan turned to the young girl, momentarily at a loss for words. Finally, Grace nodded. Yes, sweetheart. If what we believe is true, Thomas is your father. Sophie's eyes lit up with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Then we have to find him. Uncle Nathan, will you help us? Nathan, still processing the shocking revelation, found himself nodding. Of course, Sophie. If Thomas is really my brother and your father, we'll find him together. Grace looked uncertain. Nathan, you don't have to do this. It's not your responsibility. Nathan shook his head, a determined look settling on his face. No, Grace, if Thomas is my brother, that makes Sophie my niece. We're family, and family sticks together. As the gravity of the situation sank in, the three of them sat in silence for a moment. Nathan's mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of his childhood memories. Grace was lost in thoughts of the past, of the whirlwind romance that had changed her life forever. And Sophie, young and full of hope, was already dreaming of the father she'd never known. Where do we start? Grace asked, breaking the silence. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, his business instincts kicking. We start here in Phoenix. If Thomas is my twin, he might have connections here. Hold jobs, friends. Anything that might give us a lead. Sophie piped up, her voice full of excitement. Can we be like detectives? I've always wanted to solve a mystery. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Nathan couldn't help but smile at his newly discovered niece's enthusiasm. Yes, Sophie, we'll be detectives, and our mission is to find your dad. As they began to plan their search, none of them could have imagined the twists and turns that lay ahead. The mystery of Thomas Reynolds was about to unravel, revealing secrets that would change their lives forever. Over the next few days, Nathan used his business connections to dig into Thomas's past. He discovered that his twin brother had worked various jobs around Phoenix over the years, never staying in one place for too long. One sunny afternoon, as they followed up on a lead at a local construction company, Sophie spotted something that made her gasp. Look, she exclaimed, pointing to a faded mural on the side of an old building. The painting depicted a man who looked strikingly similar to Nathan, standing in front of the Grand Canyon. Grace squinted at the image. That looks just like Thomas. He always talked about his love for the Grand Canyon. Nathan studied the mural closely. The artist's signature, T.R. Thomas Reynolds. As they stood there, piecing together this new clue, a gruff voice behind them made them jump. You folks interested in that old mural? They turned to see an older man, his weathered face telling of years spent under the Arizona sun. Name's Frank. I used to work with the guy who painted that. Thomas, his name was. Talented artist, but a bit of a drifter. Sophie's eyes lit up. You knew my dad. Do you know where he is now? Frank's eyebrows shot up. Your dad? Well, I'll be. Last I heard, Thomas was talking about heading up to Flagstaff. Said something about wanting to be closer to the canyon. As Frank shared what he knew, a plan began to form. Flagstaff, nestled in the mountains of northern Arizona, was their next destination. But little did they know the truth waiting for them there would be more surprising than they could have ever imagined. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the Phoenix cityscape, Nathan, Grace, and Sophie headed back to Nathan's office. The revelations of the day weighed heavily on all of them, each lost in their own thoughts. We'll leave for Flagstaff first thing in the morning, Nathan announced as they entered his office. I'll make arrangements for accommodations and transportation. Grace nodded, gratitude shining in her eyes. Nathan, I can't thank you enough for all you're doing. You didn't have to get involved in all this. Nathan's gaze softened as he looked at Grace and Sophie. You're family now. Both of you. And I want to know my brother, to understand why he left, why our parents kept us apart. There are so many questions. Sophie, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. What if he doesn't want to see us? What if he doesn't want me? The vulnerability in the young girl's voice tugged at Nathan's heart. He knelt, down beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Sophie, listen to me. No matter what happens, you have people who love you. Your mom and now me, we're in this together, okay? Sophie nodded, a small smile breaking through her worry. As Nathan stood up, he caught Grace's eye, seeing a mix of gratitude and something else, something that made his heart skip a beat. As they prepared to embark on their journey to Flagstaff, none of them could have predicted the shocking twists that awaited them in the mountains of northern Arizona. The mystery of Thomas Reynolds was far from solved, and the truth would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, love, and the secrets of the past. The drive to Flagstaff was filled with a tense mix of anticipation and anxiety. As Nathan's luxury SUV climbed the winding roads into the mountains, the landscape changed dramatically. The barren desert gave way to towering pines, and the air grew cooler and crisper. Sophie pressed her face against the window, her green eyes wide with wonder. "It's so beautiful up here. Mom, look at all the trees." Grace smiled, grateful for her daughter's ability to find joy even in the midst of their uncertain quest. "It sure is, sweetheart. Very different from Phoenix, isn't it?" Nathan, focused on the road, couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. What would they find in Flagstaff? And more importantly, how would he react when he finally came face to face with the brother he never knew he had? As they entered the outskirts of Flagstaff, Nathan pulled into a quaint bed and breakfast nestled among the pines. "We'll set up base here," he announced, his business acumen kicking in. "It's close to downtown, so we can start our search first thing in the morning." After settling into their rooms, the trio gathered in the cozy common area to plan their next move. Sophie, ever the enthusiast, had already befriended the innkeeper's dog, a friendly golden retriever named Buddy. "So, where do we start?" Grace asked, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her sweater. Nathan pulled out his tablet, revealing a meticulously organized spreadsheet. "I've compiled a list of all the art galleries, outdoor guide services, and construction companies in Flagstaff. If Thomas is here, one of these places might have a lead on him." As they discussed their strategy, Sophie's attention was drawn to a colorful brochure on the coffee table. "Look," she exclaimed, holding it up. "Grand Canyon Adventure Tours. They do guided hikes and stuff. Maybe Dad works there." Nathan and Grace exchanged glances. It was a long shot, but given Thomas's apparent love for the Grand Canyon, it was worth checking out. The next morning, fueled by determination and copious amounts of coffee, they set out to explore Flagstaff. Their first stop was the Grand Canyon Adventure Tours office, a small but busy establishment near the historic downtown area. As they entered, a bell chimed softly above the door. The walls were adorned with stunning photographs of the Grand Canyon in all its majestic glory. Sophie's eyes lit up as she took in the images, her fingers itching to hold a camera of her own. A friendly-looking woman in her 50s greeted them from behind the counter. Her name tag read, "Linda." "Welcome to Grand Canyon Adventure Tours. How can I help you folks today?" Nathan stepped forward, his charisma on full display. "Good morning. Linda, we're actually looking for someone who might work here. His name is Thomas Reynolds. Have you heard of him?" Linda's smile faltered for a moment, a flicker of recognition passing across her face. "Thomas Reynolds, you say? May I ask why you're looking for him?" Grace placed a protective hand on Sophie's shoulder. "It's a personal matter. We're family." Linda's eyes widened as she looked between Nathan and Grace. "Oh my, you must be. Please, come with me to the back office. We should talk privately." As Linda led them through a door marked Employees Only, Sophie's heart began to race. Were they finally going to get some answers? Once in the small office, Linda gestured for them to sit. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Thomas Reynolds worked here as one of our best guides for about 2 years. He was incredible with the tourists, knew every inch of the canyon like the back of his hand, but..." "But what?" Nathan pressed, leaning forward in his chair. Linda sighed. "He left suddenly about 6 months ago. Said he needed to make things right but wouldn't elaborate. He did leave a forwarding address for his last paycheck, though. It was for a small cabin up near the north rim of the canyon. Grace gasped softly, her hand finding Sophie's. Do you still have that address?" Linda hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I probably shouldn't do this, but there's something about you folks. I can tell this is important." She scribbled an address on a piece of paper and handed it to Nathan. "It's about a 3-hour drive from here. The roads can be tricky, especially the last few miles." As they left the tour office, a mixture of excitement and apprehension filled the air. They were so close now, closer than they'd ever been to finding Thomas. But what would they discover when they reached that remote cabin? Nathan insisted on renting a rugged 4-wheel drive vehicle for the journey to the North Rim. As they set out, the landscape grew even more dramatic. Towering cliffs and deep gorges surrounded them, a testament to the raw power of nature. Sophie, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up from the back seat. "What if he doesn't like me?" she asked in a small voice. Grace turned to face her daughter, her heart breaking at the vulnerability in Sophie's eyes. "Oh, sweetheart, your father would have to be crazy not to love you. You're smart, kind, and so brave. Just be yourself, okay?" Nathan, overhearing the conversation, felt a surge of protectiveness for his newfound niece. "Your mom's right, Sophie. And remember, no matter what happens, you've got us. We're family now." As they neared their destination, the road became increasingly rough. Nathan navigated the twists and turns with careful precision, acutely aware of the precious cargo he carried. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a small cabin came into view. It was nestled among the pines, with a breathtaking view of the Grand Canyon in the distance. A beat-up old truck was parked outside, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney. Nathan pulled up and cut the engine. For a moment, no one moved, the weight of the moment holding them in place. "This is it," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. Sophie unbuckled her seatbelt, her small hand reaching for the door handle. "I'm ready," she said with a determination that belied her years. As they approached the cabin, the front door suddenly swung open. A man stepped out onto the porch, and Nathan felt as though he was looking into a mirror. It was like seeing a version of himself that had taken a different path in life. A bit more weathered, with longer hair and a scruffy beard, but undeniably his twin. Thomas froze, his eyes widening in shock as he took in the sight before him. "Nathan," he breathed, disbelief etched across his features. Nathan nodded, unable to find his voice for a moment. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a hoarse whisper. "Hello, brother." Thomas's gaze shifted to Grace, recognition and remorse flooding his eyes. "Grace, is that really you?" But before Grace could respond, Sophie stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly, even as her lower lip trembled. "Are you my dad?" The world seemed to stand still as Thomas took in the sight of the little girl before him. His eyes, so like Nathan's, filled with tears as he slowly nodded. "Yes," he said softly, "I think I am." The emotional tension in the air was palpable as the long-lost family members stood facing each other. Thomas, visibly shaken, ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar to Nathan that it sent a jolt through him. I don't know what to say," Thomas stammered. "How did you find me? Why are you here?" Nathan, finding his voice, stepped forward. "It's a long story, Thomas, one we'd like to share with you, if you're willing to listen." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Sophie. "Of course, please come inside. I think we all have a lot to talk about." As they entered the cabin, the interior revealed a simple but comfortable living space. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with texts on geology, nature, and art. Paintings of the Grand Canyon in various lights and seasons adorned the remaining wall space, all signed with the initials T. Thomas gestured for them to sit on the worn but cozy-looking couch while he pulled up a chair across from them. The crackling fire in the fireplace did little to warm the chill of awkwardness that had settled over the room. Sophie, unable to contain herself any longer, blurted out, "Why did you leave us? Didn't you want me?" The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Thomas flinched as if he'd been struck. "Oh, Sophie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know about you. If I had—" Grace interjected, her tone a mix of hurt and anger. "You left before I could tell you I was pregnant, Thomas. You just disappeared without a word." Thomas hung his head, shame evident in every line of his body. "I know, and I'm so sorry. I was young and scared. I'd gotten into some trouble with some bad people, debts I couldn't pay. I thought if I disappeared, I'd be protecting you, Grace." Nathan leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What kind of trouble, Thomas? Maybe I can help." Thomas shook his head. "It's all in the past now. I've spent the last decade trying to make amends, to become someone worthy of having a family. When I left that forwarding address at the tour company, part of me hoped, but I never imagined this." As Thomas spoke, Sophie had been studying him intently. Suddenly she stood up and walked over to him, her green eyes, so like her mother's, fixed on his face. Without a word, she threw her arms around him in a fierce hug. Thomas froze, for a moment before gently returning the embrace, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, Sophie. Can you ever forgive me?" The emotional reunion continued as Sophie clung to her newfound father, years of longing and questions pouring out in that single embrace. Grace watched, her own eyes brimming with tears, a mix of relief and lingering hurt evident on her face. Nathan, feeling like an outsider in this intimate family moment, cleared his throat gently. "Thomas, I think we all have a lot of catching up to do. Why don't you tell us what you've been doing all these years?" Thomas nodded, gently disentangling himself from Sophie but keeping her close. "You're right, Nathan. It's a long story, but you all deserve to hear it." As Thomas began his tale, the others settled in, prepared for a story that would unveil the mystery of the past 11 years. "After I left Sedona," Thomas began, his voice low and filled with regret, "I wandered for a while, taking odd jobs, here and there. I was running from my mistakes, too ashamed to face them, but everywhere I went I couldn't escape the pull of the Grand Canyon. It was like it was calling to me, offering a chance at redemption." Sophie, now curled up next to her father, listened with rapt attention. Grace and Nathan exchanged glances, both wondering what kind of troubles could have driven Thomas to abandon everything. "I eventually found work as a guide," Thomas continued. "At first, it was just a job, a way to stay close to the canyon. But then I started to see the wonder in people's eyes when they first glimpsed the vastness of it all. I realized I had a chance to make a difference, to help people connect with nature in a way they never had before." Nathan nodded, beginning to understand the passion that had driven his brother. "That's why you were so good at your job at the tour company." Thomas smiled sadly. "Yes, but it wasn't enough. I knew I had left behind so much, hurt so many people. I started using my free time to volunteer for conservation projects, trying to give back in whatever way I could." As Thomas spoke, Grace's expression softened slightly. The man before her was so different from the carefree young artist she had known in Sedona, yet somehow she could see glimpses of that same passionate soul. "But why didn't you ever try to contact us?" Grace asked, her voice trembling slightly. "All these years, Thomas. Sophie grew up without a father." Thomas's face crumpled with guilt. "I convinced myself that you were better off without me, that I would only bring trouble into your lives. It was cowardly, I know that now, but every day I worked on becoming a better man, someone worthy of the family I'd left behind." Sophie, who had been quietly absorbing every word, suddenly spoke up. "Did you ever think about us? About me?" Thomas turned to his daughter, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Every single day, Sophie. I may not have known about you, but I thought about the life I left behind, the future I could have had. I kept a photo of your mother with me always, a reminder of what I'd lost." As if to prove his point, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, creased photograph. It was the same image Sophie had shown Nathan outside the diner in Phoenix, only this copy was faded and dog-eared from years of handling. Nathan, who had been listening intently, leaned forward. "Thomas, you mentioned trouble, debts you couldn't pay. What exactly happened?" Thomas sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "It's not something I'm proud of, but you deserve to know. Back in Sedona, I got involved with some people who promised to make me a famous artist overnight. They talked about exclusive galleries, wealthy patrons, the whole 9 yards. I was young and naive and I fell for it. Grace gasped softly, beginning to understand. The art scam ring, the one that was in the news a few years ago. Thomas nodded grimly. That's the one. By the time I realized what was really going on, I was in deep. They were using my paintings as part of a money laundering scheme. When I tried to back out, they threatened me, and anyone close to me. The gravity of Thomas's confession hung heavy in the air. Nathan's mind raced, trying to process this new information about the brother he never knew he had. "So you ran," Nathan said, his voice a mix of understanding and disappointment. "I did," Thomas admitted. "I thought I was protecting everyone by disappearing. But I realize now that I was just running from my own mistakes." Sophie, wise beyond her years, squeezed her father's hand. "But you're not running anymore, right? You're here now." Thomas smiled down at his daughter, amazed by her capacity for forgiveness. "That's right, Sophie. I'm done running. When I left that forwarding address, part of me hoped that somehow, someday I'd have a chance to make things right. I never imagined it would lead to this moment." As the family continued to talk, sharing stories and slowly bridging the gap of lost years, the sun began to set over the Grand Canyon. The fading light painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, a breathtaking backdrop to the emotional scene unfolding in the small cabin. Nathan, watching his newfound family, felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. Joy at discovering his long-lost brother, amazement at the niece he never knew he had, and a growing fondness for Grace that caught him by surprise. As the evening wore on, Thomas suggested they all stay the night. "The drive back to Flagstaff can be treacherous in the dark," he explained. "I don't have much, but I can make up some beds in the living room." Grace hesitated, looking to Nathan for his opinion. Nathan nodded, sensing that this night together might be crucial for healing old wounds and forging new bonds. As they settled in for the night, Sophie snuggled between her parents on the pull-out couch, while Nathan made himself comfortable in a sleeping bag by the fireplace. The cabin was filled with a sense of peace that belied the tumultuous emotions of the day. In the quiet of the night, with soft snores filling the air, Nathan found himself unable to sleep. He stepped out onto the small porch, gazing out at the starlit expanse of the Grand Canyon. He heard soft footsteps behind him and turned to see Grace joining him. "Can't sleep either?" she asked softly. Nathan shook his head. "It's a lot to process. Yesterday I was an only child with no family besides my parents. Now I have a brother, a niece, and—" He trailed off, unsure how to define his relationship with Grace. Grace smiled softly, understanding in her eyes. "And a very complicated family situation," she finished for him. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the magnitude of the day's events settling over them. "What happens now?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan turned to look at her, really look at her for the first time since this whirlwind began. In the moonlight, he could see the strength and vulnerability that had drawn Thomas to her all those years ago. And he felt something stirring in his own heart, a feeling he wasn't quite ready to name. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know that I want to be a part of Sophie's life, and yours, if you'll let me." Grace's eyes widened slightly at the implication in Nathan's words. Before she could respond, they heard movement from inside the cabin. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his expression a mix of remorse and hope. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said softly, "and I want you both to know that I understand if there's something between you. I gave up any right to object a long time ago." The three adults stood there, the complex emotions of their unique situation hanging in the air between them. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, illuminating the vast expanse of the Grand Canyon, they knew that whatever the future held, their lives would never be the same. Inside the cabin, Sophie stirred in her sleep, a small smile playing on her lips. In her dreams, she saw a future where her family, complicated and unconventional as it was finally whole. As the sun rose over the Grand Canyon, casting a golden glow across the landscape, the newfound family began to stir. Sophie was the first to wake, her excitement palpable as she remembered where she was and who she was with. "Mom! Dad! Uncle! Nathan!" she called out, her voice filled with a joy that had been absent for so long. The adults who had barely slept made their way back inside. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of emotions, hope, uncertainty, and the lingering tension of unresolved feelings. Thomas began preparing a simple breakfast of pancakes and coffee, the domestic act feeling strange yet right. As they sat around the small table, the conversation flowed more easily than any of them had expected. "So what happens now?" Sophie asked, echoing the question that had been on everyone's minds. The adults exchanged glances, each unsure how to proceed. It was Nathan who finally broke the silence. "Well, we can't just go back to our separate lives and pretend this never happened," he said, his business acumen kicking in. "We need to figure out a way to make this work for all of us." Grace nodded, her hand unconsciously finding Thomas's on the table. "Sophie needs her father in her life. And Thomas, I think we all deserve a chance to heal and move forward." Thomas looked at his brother and the woman he had never stopped loving, his eyes filled with gratitude and hope. "I want to make things right," he said softly. "I know I can never make up for the years I've missed, but I want to try." As they discussed their options, it became clear that major changes were on the horizon for all of them. Nathan, always the problem solver, began to formulate a plan. "Thomas, you've built a life here, close to the canyon you love," he began. "What if we found a way to bring that passion to a wider audience? I have connections in the business world. We could start an ecotourism company, focusing on conservation and education." Thomas's eyes lit up at the idea. "You mean combine my knowledge of the canyon with your business expertise?" Nathan nodded, warming to the concept. "Exactly. We could create something meaningful, something that gives back to the environment and the community. And more importantly, it would give us all a chance to work together, to be a family." Grace listened, her mind racing with possibilities. "I could help too," she offered. "My experience in customer service could be useful in dealing with tourists and managing the day-to-day operations." As the adults discussed the logistics of this new venture, Sophie sat quietly, her young mind processing the changes that were about to unfold in her life. Finally, she spoke up, her voice small but determined. "Does this mean we're moving to the Grand Canyon?" The adults paused, realizing they had gotten ahead of themselves. Grace knelt beside her daughter, taking her, hands in her own. "Sweetheart, nothing's decided yet, but how would you feel about that? About living closer to your dad and spending more time with Uncle Nathan?" Sophie's face broke into a wide grin. "Are you kidding? It would be amazing. I could learn all about the canyon and take pictures and maybe even become a guide like Dad someday." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and soon all four of them were caught up in the excitement of the possibilities that lay ahead. As the day wore on, they began to flesh out the details of their plan. Nathan made several phone calls, reaching out to contacts in the tourism industry and conservation organizations. Thomas pulled out maps of the canyon, pointing out areas of interest and potential tour routes. Grace, ever practical, started making lists of everything they would need to consider: housing, schools for Sophie, permits and licenses for the business. Despite the enormity of the task ahead, there was a sense of purpose and unity that none of them had felt in years. As evening approached, they decided to take a short hike to one of Thomas's favorite viewpoints. The path was rugged but manageable, and Thomas kept a watchful eye on Sophie, offering a steady hand when needed. When they reached the overlook, the view took their breath away. The setting sun painted the canyon in hues of red, orange, and purple, the colors shifting and changing with each passing moment. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Sophie whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. Thomas put an arm around his daughter's shoulders. "This is why I could never leave. Sophie, the canyon, it has a way of putting everything into perspective. It reminds us how small we are, but also how connected we all are." Nathan and Grace stood a little apart, watching father and daughter bond over the majestic view. Without thinking, Nathan reached out and took Grace's hand in his own. She looked up at him, surprise and something more complex in her eyes. "Grace, Nathan began, but she gently placed a finger on his lips. "I know," she said softly, "but we have time to figure all of that out. Right now, let's just enjoy this moment." As they stood there, the four of them silhouetted against the vast expanse of the Grand Canyon, it felt like a new chapter was beginning. The past, with all its mistakes and regrets, couldn't be changed, but the future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility. Later that night, as they sat around the fireplace in Thomas's cabin, the conversation turned to more practical matters. "We'll need to go back to Phoenix," Grace said. "There's so much to arrange, selling the house, Sophie's school records, my job." Nathan nodded. "I'll need to restructure some of my business interests, maybe sell off a few investments to fund our new venture." Thomas looked at them both, a hint of his old insecurity creeping in. "Are you sure about this? It's a big change for all of you. I don't want you to uproot your lives just because of me." Sophie, who had been listening, quietly spoke up. "It's not just because of you, Dad. It's for all of us. We're a family now, right?" Her simple statement brought smiles to everyone's faces, easing the tension that had begun to build. "You're right, sweetheart," Grace said, pulling her daughter close. "We are a family, and families stick together." As the night wore on and plans continued to take shape, a sense of excitement and anticipation filled the small cabin. They were embarking on a new adventure, one that would challenge them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, but they would face those challenges together. The next morning, as they prepared to head back to Phoenix, the mood was bittersweet. None of them wanted to leave the tranquility of the canyon, but they knew it was necessary to set their plans in motion. Thomas walked them to their car, his face a mix of emotions. "I'll come to Phoenix in a few weeks," he promised. "By then, we should have a clearer idea of how to proceed with the business." Nathan clasped his brother's shoulder. "We'll make this work, Thomas, I promise." As Grace and Sophie said their goodbyes, Thomas pulled Nathan aside. "Take care of them for me," he said softly. "And Nathan, thank you for everything." Nathan nodded, understanding the weight of his brother's words. As they drove away, Sophie waved enthusiastically from the back seat, her other hand clutching a small rock Thomas had given her as a memento. The drive back to Phoenix was filled with conversation about the future. Sophie chatted excitedly about the animals she hoped to see, the hikes she wanted to take, and the photos she planned to capture. Grace and Nathan discussed the logistics of their move, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the radio or air conditioning controls. As they neared the outskirts of Phoenix, Nathan's phone rang. He answered it on speakerphone, his brow furrowing as he listened to the person on the other end. "I understand," he said finally. "Yes, I'll take care of it right away. Thank you for letting me know." As he hung up, Grace looked at him questioningly. "Is everything all right?" Nathan's expression was grim. "That was my lawyer. It seems someone has been asking questions about Thomas and about me. They're digging into our past, our family history." Grace gasped softly. "Do you think it's the people Thomas was involved with? The art scam ring?" Nathan shook his head. "I don't know. But whatever it is, we need to be careful. Our plans might be more complicated than we thought." As they pulled into Phoenix, the excitement of their canyon adventure was tempered by this new uncertainty. They had found each other, formed a family, and made plans for the future. But now it seemed the past wasn't quite done with them yet. The sun was setting over the city skyline as they arrived at Grace's modest home. As they got out of the car, each lost in their own thoughts about the challenges that lay ahead, Sophie's voice broke the silence. "Mom, Uncle Nathan, look," she exclaimed, pointing at the sky. They looked up to see a brilliant double rainbow arching across the darkening sky, its colors vivid against the backdrop of storm clouds. "It's beautiful," Grace breathed. Nathan put an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "It's a good sign," he said softly. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." As they stood there, watching the rainbow fade into the twilight, they knew that their journey was far from over. But with the strength of their newfound family bond, they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity for the newly formed family. Grace and Sophie began the process of packing up their life in Phoenix, sorting through years of memories and deciding what to keep for their new adventure. Nathan threw himself into researching the legal and financial aspects of starting their ecotourism business, while also trying to uncover who was digging into their family history. Thomas, true to his word, arrived in Phoenix 3 weeks after their return. The reunion was emotional, with Sophie running into her father's arms the moment he stepped through the door. As they all sat around Grace's kitchen table that evening, the reality of their situation began to sink in. "I've made some progress on the business plan," Nathan announced, spreading out a series of documents. "I've found a few potential investors who are interested in our eco-friendly approach, but—" He hesitated, glancing at Thomas. Thomas nodded, understanding his brother's unspoken concern. "But my past might complicate things," he finished. Grace reached out, taking Thomas's hand. "We'll figure it out together. That's what families do, right?" As they discussed their options, a knock at the door startled them. Nathan went to answer it, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone, ready to call for help if needed. To everyone's surprise, an elegant older woman stood on the doorstep. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes, a familiar shade of blue, darted past Nathan to where Thomas sat at the table. "Mom!" Thomas and Nathan exclaimed in unison. Elizabeth Reynolds stepped into the house, her eyes brimming with tears. "My boys," she whispered. "After all these years." The room fell silent as the brothers stared at their mother in disbelief. Sophie, sensing the tension, moved closer to Grace, who put a protective arm around her daughter. "How did you find us?" Nathan asked, his voice tight with emotion. Elizabeth smiled sadly. "I've been looking for you both for years. When I heard rumors of twins starting a business near the Grand Canyon, I knew it had to be you." As Elizabeth joined them at the table, the story of the past 30 years began to unfold. She explained how the bitter divorce had torn the family apart, with each parent taking one twin and agreeing never to speak of the other. It was a decision she had regretted every day since. "I tried to find you, Thomas," she said, reaching out to touch her son's face. "But by the time I got to Sedona, you were gone. And Nathan, your father—" She trailed off, pain evident in her voice. Nathan's jaw clenched. "Dad told me you were dead," he said flatly. "He said it was easier that way." The weight of lost years and missed opportunities hung heavy in the air. Sophie, in her innocence, broke the tension. "Does this mean I have a grandmother now too?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. Elizabeth turned to the little girl, really seeing her for the first time. "Oh my," she breathed. "You must be Sophie." "Yes, my dear. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to be your grandmother." As the night wore on, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Elizabeth, it turned out, had become a successful art dealer in New York. When she heard about the art scam that Thomas had been involved in, she had used her connections to quietly resolve the situation. "That's why no one came after you, Thomas," she explained. "I made sure all the debts were paid, all the loose ends tied up. I couldn't find you to tell you." Thomas sat back, stunned. "All these years I've been running from a threat that no longer existed." Nathan, ever the pragmatist, saw an opportunity. "Mom, your connections in the art world could be invaluable for our business. We're planning to showcase local artists as part of our ecotourism venture. Would you consider being part of it?" Elizabeth's eyes lit up. "Nothing would make me happier than to work with my boys and to get to know my granddaughter and Grace," she added, smiling warmly at them. As the family talked late into the night, plans began to take shape. With Elizabeth's help, they could expand their business idea to include an art gallery featuring works inspired by the Grand Canyon. Her reputation in the art world would lend credibility to their venture and help attract high-end clients. The next few months were a flurry of activity. Grace and Sophie moved into a beautiful home near the canyon rim, with plenty of room for Thomas to stay when he wasn't leading tours. Nathan split his time between Phoenix and their new base of operations, overseeing the business aspects, while Thomas handled the day-to-day tours. Elizabeth, true to her word, threw herself into the project with gusto. She used her connections to bring in renowned artists for residencies, creating a unique blend of nature and art that set their business apart from other tour companies. Sophie flourished in her new environment. She started taking photography classes, her natural eye for beauty enhanced by the breathtaking landscapes around her. She often accompanied her father on shorter tours, soaking up knowledge about the canyon's geology and wildlife. As for Grace, she found herself juggling her roles as mother, business partner, and something more. The connection between her and Nathan had grown stronger over the months, blossoming into a deep affection that neither could deny. One evening, as they stood on the rim watching the sunset paint the canyon in brilliant hues, Nathan turned to Grace. "I know this isn't conventional," he began, taking her hands in his. "But then again, nothing about our family is. Grace, I've fallen in love with you. I love Sophie as if she were my own. I know it might be complicated with Thomas, but—" Grace silenced him with a gentle kiss. "Life is complicated, Nathan, but love is simple. I love you too." From a distance, Thomas watched the scene unfold. A bittersweet smile played on his lips as he saw his brother and the woman he once loved find happiness together. He felt a small hand slip into his and looked down to see Sophie. "Are you okay, Dad?" she asked, her green eyes full of concern. Thomas knelt down, pulling his daughter into a hug. "I'm more than okay, sweetheart. Our family might not be traditional, but it's ours, and I wouldn't have it any other way." As the business grew and thrived, so did the bonds between this unconventional family. Elizabeth eventually moved to Arizona, buying a small house near the canyon where she could be close to her sons and granddaughter. She and Grace formed a close bond, often working together on the artistic aspects of the business. The Grand Canyon Eco Art Experience, as they named their venture, became a huge success. Tourists from around the world flocked to experience the unique blend of nature, conservation, and art. Thomas's deep knowledge of the canyon, combined with Nathan's business acumen and Elizabeth's art world connections, created something truly special. Sophie, now a teenager, had developed into a talented photographer. Her images of the canyon, capturing moments of ethereal beauty, adorned the walls of their gallery and were sought after by collectors. On the evening of the business's 5th anniversary, the family gathered on a private overlook to watch the sunset. As the sky exploded into a riot of colors, Nathan raised a glass. "To family," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "To second chances and new beginnings." "To the canyon," Thomas added, "for bringing us all together." "To love," Grace said, softly squeezing Nathan's hand. "To art and beauty," Elizabeth chimed in, her eyes twinkling. Sophie, her camera hanging around her neck, grinned at her unconventional but loving family. "To us," she said simply, "just the way we are." As they stood there, silhouetted against the majestic backdrop of the Grand Canyon, they knew that their journey had been extraordinary. From a chance encounter outside a Phoenix diner to building a life and business together, they had weathered storms, faced their pasts, and emerged stronger. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. In the fading light, Sophie captured one last photo, her family, arms around each other, framed by the enduring beauty of the canyon. It was a moment frozen in time, a testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bonds of family. As darkness fell and the first stars began to twinkle in the vast Arizona sky, they made their way back to the lodge. Tomorrow would bring new tourists, new challenges, and new opportunities. But for now they were content in the knowledge that whatever life might throw their way, they would face it together, as a family.